Hello everyone, this is Anirban Datta, and today on behalf of the GEOSTRATA, I'm excited to host an expert panel discussion focusing on the Indo-Pacific policy of France and its implications for regional stability and partnerships. Multilateral exchanges and partnerships in the region remains a key factor in maintaining resilient supply chains, freedom of navigations, and enhanced economic and security policy. So in order to focus more on this topic, we're happy to introduce Dr. Paco Milhiet, visiting fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore, Dr. Mathieu Duchâtel, resident senior fellow and director of international studies at the Institut Montaigne, France, Dr. Éric Frécon, adjunct fellow from the IRASEC, Bangkok, and Ms. Simran Walia, associate fellow from the Center for Riyadh Power Studies, New Delhi. So we are excited to have all of you among us. And so firstly, we will start ahead with the opening statements and how exactly France's economic policy is shaping in the entire region. So my first questions, and this was also a beginning of the opening statements from all of our panelists. Like, given your research on Chinese geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific region, how do you see France's Indo-Pacific strategies in tackling China's influence regarding illegal territorial claims?
Should I go first?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Greetings and salutation to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here, and hello to my fellow colleagues and friends, Éric and Mathieu. So just as an opening remark, I work at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and this week we had our major flagship event, which is called the Asia-Pacific Program for Senior Military Officer, the APSMO. And this morning, we had the privilege of hosting a very famous Indian scholar named Raja Mohan, that I probably do not need to introduce to anyone here. And he pointed out something, I think, very interesting in his speech, which was discussing the strategic complexities of international relations. And he emphasized one point that I found particularly relevant for our discussion, which is that domestic policies play a significant role. It plays a significant role for every country, particularly now with the USA election. We know that domestic policy is important. It plays a role in China. It plays a role for the ASEAN countries. It plays a role for the European countries. It plays a role for France. It's for every international relations subject, Lebanon, Ukraine, etc. It's also true for the Indo-Pacific strategy, the French Indo-Pacific strategy. However, I believe that this aspect of international relation is often overlooked or neglected by the French authorities. There is, in fact, a growing dichotomy between the international narrative promoted by the state and the French president Emmanuel Macron since 2018, and the realities on the ground. It's particularly visible nowadays in New Caledonia. So I just have one quick example, and then I will end here for my opening statement. A year ago, our president Emmanuel Macron visited the state of Vanuatu. It's a small insular country neighboring New Caledonia in the South Pacific. In his speech, our president condemned a new form of imperialism in the South Pacific, clearly referring to China, the People's Republic of China. Emmanuel Macron then advocated for a protection through partnership of the independence and sovereignty of all states in the region. France needs to protect and help independence and sovereignty of each state in the region. Less than a year later, riots and looting erupted in the neighboring overseas territory of New Caledonia, and most of the rioters were denouncing France's colonial and imperial policy with the support of many neighboring politicians, including politicians from Vanuatu. So we can see that there is a growing disconnection between France's international strategies and the local realities in the overseas territories. And I think perhaps internal consideration have not been sufficiently taken into account regarding the local realities, and the international narrative, I think, could benefit from a more inclusive and vision of our overseas territories actors.
So we have raised a very critical issue about overseas territories and the island and the fate of the island nations, especially when we talk about France's Indo-Pacific strategy as a whole. Like my next questions and the opening statement will come to Dr. Mathieu. Considering the geopolitical strategies and the economic interest in the region, especially concerning how the Asian countries actually approach in the Pacific region, how exactly is it different from France's, and what exactly the maximum collaborations can range in beneficial results for both the sides?
Well, thank you very much for your question, and greetings to you and also to my esteemed French colleagues whom I'm very happy to share the panel with. I always ask the same question whenever I meet a French or a European diplomat about the Indo-Pacific. I ask them, so if you want to make it extremely tangible, what's really in there for you? It's a very vast region. There are many foreign policy issues that are linked to the Indo-Pacific, but that would exist even without the Indo-Pacific as a construction. And I think the best answer I ever got came from a diplomat from Finland who told me, actually, it's extremely useful for me to use this Indo-Pacific framing when I speak to many economic stakeholders in Finland, because through that, they understand diversification. And I think this notion of diversification, when you trace back the history of the French Indo-Pacific strategy, has been very central to the formation of this strategy from the beginning. Of course, you know, issue number one has always been maritime security and the question of international law at sea. But the other very central elements of this Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think for France and for the EU as well, is the notion of diversification away from an excessively Sino-centric approach to, let's say, Asia to start with. And to me, so it's a strategic notion. It's very important at the scale of France, because French Asia policy used to be very much centered on the Sino-French strategic partnership 20 years ago under the presidency of Jacques Chirac, for example. I think we came a long way, and now this idea of diversification has really gained ground. And so to answer your question, I would say that now, when we talk about diversification in the context of the Indo-Pacific, for France and for Europe, the questions that are in front of us are trade diversification, supply chain diversification to manage risks, especially risks related to geopolitics surrounding China, and to some extent, investment diversification, which is related to supply chain. And slowly, I think that France, and to some extent the EU as well, are moving from an approach that is centered on maritime security to an approach that is centered on economic diversification. I stop here with my opening remarks.
So you were talking about mostly about the Indo-Pacific region and how France should see it, if I can summarize it for the audience. So I would like to give the floor to Ms. Simran. Like, given your research in the East Asian foreign policy, how do you view France's Indo-Pacific policy intersecting with Japan's strategy in the region? Do you see any opportunities in the trilateral cooperations with India?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for the question. So basically, I think we all know that how China's increasing power and territorial claims, as well as the global competition underway with the United States, are weakening the balance of power in this entire region. And France seeks to preserve a rules-based international order, an approach that it shares with its main partners. Now, if I speak in the context of Japan, so the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision and Initiative, launched officially in 2016, marked an important development in post-war Japanese diplomacy and integrated economic and security policies into a cohesive external strategy. So the core objective of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision has been to promote peace, stability, and economic prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. And some of the objectives that intersect with France's Indo-Pacific strategy as well are like stronger involvement in settling regional crises and addressing these issues of terrorism, radicalization, and organized crime. And then France's one of the objectives of France Indo-Pacific strategy has been to strengthen and increase France's partnership with China, including via the European Union through the framework of confident and constructive political dialogue with a focus on deepening economic and trade relations. France also wishes to increase relations with its strategic partners such as Japan and India in this Indo-Pacific region. And where Japan and France's Indo-Pacific vision intersects is also in playing a greater role in regional organizations, especially the ASEAN-related platforms, to contribute to the development of multilateralism. Then France's goals of Indo-Pacific do overlap with those of its partners and allies. The goals include freedom of navigation on the sea and in the air, which France intends to uphold through dialogue and discussion. They also include safety and security, particularly in regards to terrorism. Then France and Japan also share a common position on the defense of international law and democracy. And they also share a similar assessment of the international situation. Like the two states recently adopted cooperation roadmap, which emphasizes shared views on the Middle East, Ukraine, North Korea's nuclear ambitions, and Taiwan crisis as well. So indeed, both countries do support Taiwan's joining international organizations. And France's territories in the Indo-Pacific are members of international groupings. So the notion of autonomous territories having a voice on the world stage is not foreign to the French in the recent times. And like military cooperation is one area where France and Japan's cooperation is making substantial progress. Though dealing with the civilian bureaucracy as well as the military one in Japan can prove challenging, according to the French, who are keen on operational cooperation with Japan. And then there have also been talks regarding the reciprocal access agreement between Japan and France. And this is an agreement which Japan has already signed with Australia and the United Kingdom. So the two countries agreed to launch negotiations to that end during former Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's visit to Paris in May this year. Japan and France also held 6 iterations of the joint bilateral exercise Oguri Verni in 2022 and 23. And Japan also participated in 2 editions of the La Perouse multilateral exercise in August 22 and 2023. And so I think France actively engages in military cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region, and the French do take part in the major multilateral exercises organized by the United States and Australia as well. The 2+2 summit meeting in between Japan and France in 2024 made a roadmap for Japan-France cooperation, which was both drafted at the same time. And with Japan, France has also developed an exceptional partnership which is specifically adapted to the Indo-Pacific region. And so basically, if we for India, Japan and France, who aim to work together in the region, this necessitates the clarifying capacities and commitments in specifically 4 areas of cooperation. One of them would be leveraging logistics agreement between the 3 and more involvement between the navies. Secondly, I think France, Japan, and India can collaborate in setting up of the underwater sensors in the Andaman Islands, which could help create a better understanding of the maritime domain. Thirdly, cooperation on defense technology can be one area where these 3 nations can come together, because as we know that how India and Japan have shared their relations in terms of defense technology, and since Japan and France do have common visions of Indo-Pacific, I think the defense technology area would be a great potential for these 3 to maintain a trilateral agreement. And lastly, of course, acknowledging each other's limitations, especially on the issue of China, because these 3 nations do share a great deal of concerns and interests, particularly in light of China's growing assertiveness and revisionism about its territory and maritime claims. I would like to stop here for now. Thank you.
So you have talked a bit more about multilateralism and exactly what exactly are the strategies for the same, and France is also adopting with regard to multilateral framework of the world order as well as the Indo-Pacific region as a whole. But I would like to come back to Dr. Éric, because of your substantive diplomatic and France's substantive military and and diplomatic presence in the Indo-Pacific region. It has a firm hold in the maritime security, especially as we can see during since the Middle Ages as well. What exactly do you think the measures or policies France can undertake, especially to bolster a region's security amidst Chinese provocations?
Yeah, thank you very much. And sorry, it seems there was a technical issue just now. Apologies for that. And no, I don't know which lesson. I mean, first of all, France should be very humble and not to give lesson and to come only if there is a requirement. This is a first condition. And then also, back to what I was trying to say just now, it takes platform, forums, vectors, I don't know, channels, to be able precisely to create link relationship and to discuss or elaborate policy and strategy. But to answer your question, first, so it's about governance in territorial waters, yes. There is something which is a little known, but in terms of governance and administrative model, you know, in France, we do not have a Coast Guard. And this is a key issue right now, especially in Southeast Asia. I can see especially Indonesia, nowadays in Singapore, Thailand, and more, precisely to try to fuse all these maritime law enforcement agency to work together and not in silos, you know, vertically. And then France can share experience. You know, France is this second largest EEZ in the world. So we have experience to deal with these new challenges, gray zone tactics and non-traditional security. And then this is something which could be helpful for all these countries, plus case-by-case bilateral agreement and cooperation, for example, to fight illegal and unreported, unrated fishing in the Pacific with some Pacific island countries. With Australia as well. Australia has two small islands, but far away from the country, so France helped to patrol. And so this is for territorial waters and governance. Maybe later I will elaborate more about maritime domain awareness, but it's a different issue. In terms of climate change, that's what I was trying to say about this initiative with India, Australia, this climate and defense strategy, and maybe a short focus on this, you know, this new treaty. You have the BBNJ, you know, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So France ratified the treaty last June. And so there is this call for more and more countries to ratify, plus this call for a moratorium on deep sea mining, which is also a key issue. So this is something on which France can work. So to prevent climate change, etc. And in case of natural disaster, France also, we have some agreements, and maybe little known, this France, you know, France, Australia, New Zealand agreement, which is 31 years old. You have also these famous exercises in the Pacific, Croix du Sud, Marara, with tons of navies, regional navies. And then I remember I was in Indonesia. There is an issue which is, I feel, a bit neglected: oil spills on the beaches in Indonesia, but also in Singapore this year. And then we have this institute in France, CEPOL, which is an international expert to fight pollution at sea. So this is some in terms of energy security. I think this was also in your list, and then I will be done. So of course, back to this governance of territorial waters to secure all these sea lines of communication. Maybe just a reminder about how France is part also of this enforcement coordination cell, you know, to control, you know, this embargo in North Korea, because you have also illegal trafficking over there. And also, it's very new in the region. I guess you heard about that. The rising issue, this ship-to-ship transfer, and then which can cause also oil spills, again, pollution. And I feel that sometimes there is like, no, I don't want to see. I don't know. We have to explore because it's not that clear. And again, with maritime domain awareness and all these tools, we should be able to figure out, to connect all this traffic from Iran, I don't know, via Dubai, etc., India, and then to China and North Korea. And just a last point, because I heard about that recently, and indeed, maybe I should add on your list this seabed warfare strategy. because this is another issue. We talk about energy security, but what about the flow of information, undersea cable, and not only we talk about deep sea mining, etc. So all this area far, I mean, deep in the sea. So France tried to elaborate a policy strategy and to get better equipment, and then to share with all the countries in the region.
So that was a great observation, to be honest enough. And now I would like to head back to Dr. Paco. Being the first European country in the region, especially when we talk about France, it has outlined a strategy for the Indo-Pacific region. Like, how do you think like the France's Indo-Pacific region is currently aligning with the regional fault lines, and as well as with the growing, emerging in the security and infrastructure challenges which is currently coming up in the region?
Sure. So first, we have to remember that since Brexit in 2016, I think, France remains the only European Union member state with sovereign territories in the Indo-Pacific. Before, you also had the UK with the Pitcairn Islands and the territories in the Indian Ocean, but now they're out of the EU. So France is the only one left with in the Indian Ocean, La Réunion, Mayotte, Terres Australes et Antarctiques Françaises, which are the Antarctic lands. I don't remember the name in English. And in the Pacific, New Caledonia, Wallis et Futuna, French Polynesia, and the inhabited island of Clipperton. So while exercising sovereignty, national sovereignty, is a crucial element of France's Indo-Pacific strategy, the French diplomacy has also played a leading role inside the EU in shaping a continental, I would say, Indo-Pacific strategy. So France was the first European country to adopt officially an Indo-Pacific strategy in 2018, but it was then followed by countries like Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, and now we have several discussions in other countries. Maybe Mathieu would know more, but I think Italy is thinking about it, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, etc. We even had the European Union as an institution who adopted an official strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific in 2021. And since 2022, we have an official forum, an interministerial forum for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific that is organized by the European Union. The first edition was in Paris, and funny fact, neither China nor the United States were invited. That's already emphasizing the specificities of the French and maybe the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, which is inclusive and maybe exclusive of the two superpowers, US and China. So I think for the European Union, engaging with the Indo-Pacific makes obviously a lot of sense, given the region's growing security and infrastructure challenges. As a global economic power, the EU heavily depends on maritime routes and infrastructure, notably going through the Indo-Pacific. Almost 80% of Europe external trade and 35% of its internal trades flows through maritime channels. And moreover, nearly all global communication are on the sea cables, as Eric just pointed out. So both EU and France aims to be at the forefront of for addressing global common challenges. Several key concerns, like most countries in the Indo-Pacific, upholding freedom of navigation, securing economic interest, addressing non-traditional security threats, just like Eric pointed out. And also, let's remember that the EU has been actively involved in the region in several maritime operations through its member states. So we had Opération Atalanta in 2008, which was a counter-piracy mission in the Horn of Africa. More recently, and still ongoing, we have Opération Aspides, which is a military deployment in response to the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. And we also have many kinds of deployments, such as the Operation Pégase, which is a rapid aerial deployment of dozens of combat aircraft to Asia, and took for the first time in 2024 took place within a European framework. Most of the time was led by French Air Force, but this year we had German aircraft and UK aircraft. So yeah.
And now I would like to come to Dr. Mathieu. Like, based on your experience, especially while working with regard to Chinese foreign policy, how do you envision an ongoing conflict in between China and Taiwan will influence in the Pacific region on an economic scale? And do you think this particular incident will have a spillover effect over the global supply chains, and especially how this will affect like France's Indo-Pacific strategy in the long run?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. I personally tend to think of the Taiwan Strait as the center of gravity of Indo-Pacific geopolitics. Not everyone would agree with that, but I think that since the 1995-1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, when China decided to invest heavily in what we know as area denial, access denial capabilities to prevent the US Navy and the US Air Force from approaching the island of Taiwan by threatening to impose heavy costs. I think from that starting point, there has been a need for the US to really expand the geographical scale of strategic competition with China. I think we have to remember that in the early 90s, the US and Taiwan had absolute air superiority in the Taiwan Strait. For example, these days, we often speak of the Chinese Air Force or naval aviation crossing the median line in the Taiwan Strait, which is not a territorial demarcation. It's a symbolic line in the middle of the Taiwan Strait. But in the early 90s, the Taiwanese Air Force was also crossing the median line and conducting surveillance operations near the Chinese coast. So I think the balance of power has changed, and it's important for the US to balance the rise of the Chinese military with a much larger coalition that includes Australia, that to some extent, although it's a very complicated question, I'm aware, also brings in India in that game, and also brings in some European countries. So to me, there's this link between the Taiwan Strait and the Indo-Pacific. On your question regarding supply chains, I think it's a relatively new discovery that there is a major supply chain risk that is related to Taiwan contingencies. Everyone used to speak of the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea as very important, transit areas for commercial shipping, and we all know that, and that's in a way a supply chain issue. But what we have in mind now is more the question of some very strategic sectors, and in particular the semiconductor sector. I think all industrialized economies have experienced in 2020 this sudden shortage of semiconductor supplies, and this really brought to the forefront the reliance of many economic sectors on access to Taiwanese semiconductors. In a way, it has brought up the strategic value of Taiwan in the minds of many policymakers, including in the United States, but it has also resulted in pressure on Taiwanese companies to diversify, especially coming from the US. And I think what we observe, if you go back to France, and let's talk about French companies here, I think the way they look at geopolitical risk and supply chain issues is at least twofold. First, they think if they rely on Chinese suppliers in their supply chains, and some do in the automotive sector, Airbus would rely on Chinese suppliers for some parts of aircraft production. The first thing they would have in mind is if there is a Taiwan Strait conflict, there will almost, it's extremely likely that there will be Western sanctions and that the EU, or if there is no unanimity within the EU, several EU member states will join a coalition led by the US sanctioning China. And sanctioning China will mean that China will play the retaliation game, and there will be also sanctions perhaps on those supply chains. So they need to deal with that kind of risk. I think it's the first element. And the second element is it's more classic, and that's especially for the companies that are present in Taiwan. And there are many European companies and also to some extent French companies that are present in Taiwan. How do they deal with the various military contingencies in the Taiwan Strait? I will give you one example, but I think it's very telling. You know that Taiwan has a high dependency on imports of liquid natural gas, LNG. There are 2 ships bringing LNG to Taiwan per week. One of them is Total Energy, the French company. So if there was a blockade in the Taiwan Straits, France would be immediately involved or impacted only through that. There would be that French angle to the Taiwan Strait crisis. So what is the solution to that? I think greater risk awareness is essential. Diversification, as I was saying earlier, is very important. And reducing vulnerabilities in your supply chain, which is a very long and extremely complex process, because you have your tier A and your tier B and your tier C, and just the understanding of your supply chain when you're a large company involves a lot of investment and efforts.
One of the important observations that I have got from your statement is that geopolitical and supply chain issues are a twofold problem. So, given such a problem, I'd like to come back to Dr. Éric. Given France's Indo-Pacific visions of including Indo-Pacific region, which inherently resonates with the Southeast Asia. Like, do you think France can provide a knowledge and expertise in the governance of territorial waters, climate change, and energy security through its Indo-Pacific strategy?
Yeah, as I said just now, and maybe this is the opportunity to because I talk a bit about that just now, but maybe the opportunity to focus more on maritime domain awareness, which is the key in terms of to complement the governance of territorial waters, and which can be linked also on because China is in the air in the background of this conversation, all the gray zone tactics, etc. So and indeed for that we have a French technology, also some company which are able to precisely, when you have your ship and this automatic identification system, some of them precisely for illegal purpose try to switch off, and then you have this dark fleet, and then they can commit crime, etc., or illegal activity. And then, but with this technology, there is a possibility to still track all these ships. And I saw this company precisely trying to work together with some country in the region to try to precisely still figure out where are all these ships. And then once you know where the ships are, and so you have the technology, you have also the voluntary naval control cooperation, VNC, which is something not that unique, but France was used to have this cooperation between French Navy and the shipping industry. It's a win-win process, meaning if you shipping industry see something, you share with us in the French Navy, and vice versa. So, and this plus the technology is a good way to have the global picture of maritime traffic. And then after, the idea is to share not only at the national level, and back to what I said just now about the coordination between all the law enforcement agencies under one authority instead of working side by side, but working together under prime minister or president, depending your country. This is one thing, and then to share with the other countries. And you have now platform, but the question is, what about this platform? You have the EU platform, which pretend to be totally neutral and free. You have a US platform named C-Vision, very famous, but it's under linked to the US government. And then you have all this network of liaison officers. And for example, this focus on all the information fusion centers, because for example, you have one in Singapore, the first one in Singapore, 2009, I think. Then one in Madagascar, then now one in New Delhi, one in Peru as well. Every time France was one of the first countries to send a liaison officer there, and then it's a good way to coordinate. Plus, you have in France this MICA center in Brest, we try same to facilitate the information sharing. And interestingly, to answer your question, this IFC started by working only on piracy and armed robberies against ships, but then after they made it broader and broader by including illegal trafficking, migration, illegal fishing, accident at sea, maritime terrorism, and also now they have crime, environmental crimes, but to be honest, not so much incidents are reported, and cyber security as well, which is very trendy. But Sam, there is not so much incidents which are reported. So but still, you can see this move from maritime security and just piracy and terrorism, and the move to what the United Nations human security, including environmental issues. Yeah.
Now, I'd like to come back to Ms. Simran. Like Dr. Éric raised a very important issue with regard to maritime domain awareness. But this particular topic is very similar with regard to maritime, that when we talk about maritime choke points, the importance of strategy surrounding it. And this is very important in the case when we talk about it from the context of India. Like, how do you assess the importance of France's Indo-Pacific strategy and presence with regard to maritime choke points and with regard to the concerns which almost all the Indo-Pacific countries shared in this particular region?
Okay, so France is known to be the first-ranked maritime and naval power, which regularly exercises its right of maritime and air navigation wherever needed, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. Also, the French armed forces in the Indo-Pacific play an active role in operations against illegal trafficking, like drugs. Illegal fishing is also mentioned by Dr. Éric. So, particularly in Europe, France is known to be distinctive in claiming that its boundaries actually extend outside Europe into the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which is, of course, the Indo-Pacific, through its overseas departments and overseas territories, which are considered integral parts of France and also of the European Union. And so these Indo-Pacific possessions also have large exclusive economic zones. And I think France has the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world. And therefore, to defend the entire freedom of navigation becomes important for France. And maritime security all over the world, we know that is based on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which also aims to preserve the freedom of navigation. So France's naval commitment across the Pacific intends to promote and defend this international rules-based order. France also supports the strict application of the United Nations Convention for the Law of Sea and contributes to actions against crime at sea, and is keen on actively demonstrating its commitment to the freedom of navigation. So it also aims to develop its maritime surveillance capability in the region through capacity building, networking of partners, and information sharing. Maritime security may also indeed be the least common denominator that gathers the majority of the Indo-Pacific countries, from great powers to small island countries as well. The maritime domain awareness is a requirement for better managing one's own sovereign territory. With the Indo-Pacific region being a geographic translation of a strategic concept, I think India, Japan, and France agree to this basic line of construction and do share a common vision. So back then in 2017, India and France signed a wide shipping agreement to enable information sharing on maritime traffic and maritime domain awareness in the Indian Ocean region. And in 2018, a logistics exchange MOU granting a reciprocal access to each other's bases was also signed. And since then, the French frigate Cassard made a port call in the Mumbai harbor. And in March 2020, despite the pandemic, an Indian Navy aircraft visited La Réunion to conduct a coordinated maritime patrol with the French forces. Basically, I think all these examples show that these two countries do cooperate in the maritime security, particularly. And they have also signed a common strategic vision for their cooperation in the Indian Ocean, which includes maritime intelligence and protection and exchange of sensitive information. India and France are co-developing a constellation of satellites as well to monitor the Indian Ocean in an effort to further strengthen the maritime domain awareness. So, speaking about Japan, Japan do appear as a key partner for France, as it has the capacity to help monitor the sea lanes of communications in this region, and also shares France's concern about keeping multipolarity in the region and avoiding Chinese hegemony, as I already mentioned before. So, I think the forums like the Indian Ocean Regional Association deserve a mention, as in recent example where India has been the founding member and France also recently became a member, and Japan is an observer. So it is one of the forums that can be relied upon to give results. I think similar coordination can be done in the capacity building, particularly in Africa, where there is a clear need and situation is fast evolving. A key trilateral partnership can be created if Japan and India supported France's candidacy to become a member of the Heads of the Asian Coast Guard Agencies meeting, which is an apex level forum for facilitating the Coast Guard agencies of the countries in Asia. And similarly, I think France also expects Japanese backing to enter multilateral security cooperation forums in East Asia, such as the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. There's also the possibility of extending the long-standing Coast Guard cooperation between India and Japan to France, to at least on a case-to-case basis. So the need to focus on thematic issues with a strong potential political impact, like fisheries, should be a priority for these three nations. And I think fisheries is a strategic area where exploration can be made with overlapping naval consideration and economics. Lastly, Japan and France also maximize their humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, and also are planning and do incorporate India in this particular domain. So basically, I think partnership in the domain of maritime security is influenced by the commitments to international law, which are unhindered maritime access, trade, and energy security. Thank you. I would stop here.
So I would like to come back to Dr. Paco, because when Dr. Simran was actually talked about the importance of free and open Indo-Pacific region, and this actually radiates with the topic, with the importance, thematic areas, and importance of the political importance of this particular region. Amid the rise of major geopolitical powers, the Indo-Pacific region has seen a significant degree of involvement by France, especially with regard to strategic developments. To what extent do you think the collaboration with regional partners and regional allies can help to achieve this goal, especially when if we consider free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific Pacific region as one of its prime importance in this region?
Sure. Well, I'll be very candid and honest. I think France is particularly visible in Asia, and France in the Indo-Pacific region is not a first nor even a second major player. It's a third party actor. Its presence is welcomed by many, but is not necessarily expected. Therefore, collaboration with other like-minded partners is a sine qua non, is an indispensable condition. So unlike some Anglo-Saxon or pro-American countries, France has always emphasized on an inclusive Indo-Pacific strategy. In other words, not directly directed against anyone / China. Quite similarly to India's Indo-Pacific strategy when Prime Minister Modi announced it in 2018. So the big question for France is how to define like-minded partners. So for sure, France and India are like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific. Our colleague just before reminded us of this. Japan, of course. Australia is a tricky question. Maybe Éric has words on this after. ASEAN countries, of course, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, the USA. Tension exists on other subjects in Europe, specifically, especially if Trump turns to power. Yet in the Pacific, let's remember that the US are in this indispensable partner for the French forces. And I think last but not least, China, Mathieu reminded us that the French-Asian policy has long been direct, like Sino-centric policy. And last year, we had a good example of this when President Macron returned from Beijing, advocating for strategic autonomy and saying that we should not be always following the US. So there was kind of a controversy. And on the other side, we have a political discourse at the national and European level, asking for decoupling, de-risking towards China. So I think this is an interesting and a major question. From my personal experience here in Singapore, I can meet with a lot of French businessmen or French companies, and I think decoupling to China is going to be very hard, just as Mathieu said previously, very complicated. So we've talked about Total, but we can also talk about another major French company that has a big implication in the Indo-Pacific, which is the shipping company CMA CGM, that has lots of assets in China. So obviously decoupling or de-risking is going to be very complicated. So just to sum up, I think for France, in the Indo-Pacific, it's necessary to choose its interdependencies according to the evolution of the international context. So yeah.
So as you have mentioned, it's one can be considered as a joke as well. But while we are describing about France's Indo-Pacific strategy, but China as one of the important countries in the region stays in the background. So before much ado, I would like to go back quickly to Dr. Mathieu. Since the economic relations between China and the EU are favorably inclined towards China, how do you perceive France's economic goals in the Indo-Pacific strategy, given what Dr. Paco actually talked about? Like, it is very difficult to decouple from China, and giving the due importance to the supply chain resilience, would these economic security goals and efforts be able to initiate a breakthrough?
Well, it's a very interesting time to talk about economic relations between France and China and the EU and China because of what is going on with the electric vehicles tariffs that the European Union has just placed on imports of Chinese electric vehicles into the European Union in a move that was, to some degree, I mean, it's collective and there was a vote among the 27 EU member states, but pushed by France. And now you've probably heard that as a result of those tariffs, which are the result of a very, rules-based, WTO respectful investigation into subsidies that Chinese companies and, in fact, other companies producing in China have received from the Chinese state to export. China has threatened to retaliate against some categories of products, one of which directly targets France because it's brandy. And 99% of European exports of brandy to China are exports of French brandy. I'm mentioning this because it's in the news, but it points to the fact that there may be an escalation of trade tensions between the EU and China going forward. And there may be some specific targeting of French trade interest, which could open a cycle of tit for tat retaliation one thing you hear among people who follow this very closely is that if there was anti-dumping duties placed on French brandy, that could lead to the activation of the anti-coercion instrument, which is an instrument of the European Union that can result in many different actions being taken on the trade and investment side, restrictive actions to even restricting access to the European market for some categories of Chinese products. So, to go back to the big picture, I think we are in a very interesting situation in which, as I see it, China depends enormously on exports to the EU single market. 515 billion euros of exports last year. It's absolutely huge. You can argue that China depends more on access to the EU single market than Europe depends on the Chinese market for its exports. There is a phenomenon of asymmetric dependency, but China, because it's a unitary actor, is very skilled at threatening escalation, which the Europeans never do, actually. If you watch this case carefully, it's very interesting. The Chinese side has always responded with threats of escalation. The European side has always been, very squarely within the framework of its legal instruments and within the framework of WTO. And I think what this could lead to is greater awareness in Europe that perhaps always playing by the rules is making us very vulnerable. I think that this episode is leading to some rethinking in Europe. And just to connect to the Indo-Pacific, it's very interesting to look at the letter of mission that the president of the European Commission, von der Leyen, sent to the Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security, because she says two things. She says, you need to deal with asymmetries in EU-China trade and economic relations, and you really need to diversify in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think in terms of strategizing, it's very much connected.
So as you mentioned, $515 worth of trade is important for any bloc, and especially when it is backed by threats and when it is leveraged on the basis of that, it becomes headache and becomes a very important factor when we consider the whole the geopolitical calculus of the Indo-Pacific region. Like, I'd like to come quickly to Dr. Éric. Given the significance of trade routes, especially for France, like, what exactly are the opportunities that lies in front of it, and what exactly are the initiatives that France can launch, especially by ensuring the freedom of navigation, as also to make sure that it can have an uninterrupted flow of goods to stabilize the Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, not easy. I see the time is running. So your question about freedom of navigation, what France can do, yeah, right? And I mean, not easy. And of course, depending of, we have, I mean, the size of the French and the equipment and the presence, military presence, I'm not so sure we can do so much. But that said, again, so MDA is a key precisely to figure out about what can be about the presence of Chinese Navy or Chinese militia around the sea, along the sea lanes of communication. There was this idea of FONOPS, I mean, initiated by the US Navy. So France tried to do kind of FONOPS, not within the 12 nautical miles, but still to sail across these very sensitive areas. And so they did it quite regularly. Alas, unfortunately, I would say they do with some frigates coming from far away, or with deployment from a homeland. Ideally, we should have more persistent or permanent forces in the region. because even if France claim being so Indo-Pacific power, Nouméa indeed is not that far, but it's not that near. And if you check the distance between La Réunion and Southeast Asia, Nouméa, Southeast Asia is quite similar. So in terms of freedom of navigation operation, not so sure we can do so much. And then there is all this lawfare as well. And back to what I tried to say the first question, and France has to be more vocal to talk about this international law of the sea. And you know, there was this award by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So I think France can do a bit more about that. But to be honest, I won't believe, I do not believe so much. So first, you know, you have this idea of joint development agreement in very sensitive area where you have a dispute over territorial or EEZ, territorial waters of EEZ. It works between Thailand and Cambodia, but with China and Philippines, not so much. And then the code of conduct, I mean, it's an old story, but, you know, years after years, decade after decades, you know, there was this Australian expert who talked about the bonds. You know, it's like a bonds. China give a bonds, you know, to the Southeast Asian diplomats. Then they go back to their country after all this annual summit, yearly summit. But then at the end of the day, this is always the same stories because there is no enforcement. You know, I mean, the ASEAN, the nature of ASEAN, this idea of mufakat, you know, of consensus. So not so sure we can expect so much about that. I believe I mean, the solution, I don't know, but will come, as Paco said, and Rajaratnam, from domestic politics, maybe in China. And just as I said, this idea of MDA, because, you know, this very slow, progressive fait accompli, I mean, strategy by China. So it takes to be very aware. And then now Philippines is working more about transparency. You have also this idea of sea light project, because this idea is precisely to highlight all these gray zone tactics by China to be sure that there will be this freedom of navigation.
That is an interesting observation, but I would like to, since we are currently in short of time, I would like to come back to Ms. Simran for the last questions and the remarks. In the context of regional frameworks, especially when we consider about Quad and the ASEAN-led mechanisms, how do you see that the France can leverage these platforms to ensure freedom of navigation and promote multilateralism in the Pacific region?
Okay, so I think we've seen these idea of multilateralism and unilateralism gaining traction in recent years, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. And so basically taking into account the coexistence of several models such as the free and open Indo-Pacific, ASEAN-led multilateralism and Quad, France aims to propose an alternative aimed at promoting a stable and law-based multipolar order in an inclusive and balanced way. So I think the stability should be fostered through an international order based on dialogue and multilaterally set rules to deal with transnational risks and governance of the commons such as maritime security, cyber security, nuclear proliferation, etc. And in this regard, I think there are specific pillars that are kept in consideration, such as the maritime security, connectivity, infrastructure, and environmental issues. And all these priorities relate to the ocean, the good order at sea, the sustained management of the marine resources, and safety of the sea lanes. France has maintained close and dynamic strategic partnerships with the 4 members of the Quad countries. However, France has so far refused to formally be associated with the Quad. And this also has to do something with Paris trying to walk a fine line on China, while it is clear that France's Indo-Pacific strategy is motivated by China's rise and has elements of a hedging approach vis-a-vis Beijing. By sending signals and seeking to gain leverage through its partners, France also seeks to avoid antagonizing China completely. France's presence and free position capabilities in the region must be accentuated by a greater connect with regional formats such as the Quad so the France's two-phase La Pérouse exercise also was held for the first time in the Bay of Bengal in 2021, which saw Paris collaborating with the Quad states for elaborate naval tactical maneuvers for surface warfare, anti-air warfare, and air defense, which shows that France is trying to gain partnerships with the Quad member countries. If we talk about France, India, and Japan trilateral again, I think these three countries can again try and further bolster this Quad partnership, France's Quad partnership, and also because these three countries can ensure sustainable growth in the Indo-Pacific region, and also cooperate to ensure the resilient supply chains, particularly for the critical minerals. France has also been committed to deepening its relationship with the ASEAN. Also back in 2021, this partnership covered a number of fields such as that of the global public goods, such as health and environment. Again, the France's understanding of the Indo-Pacific at the presidential level was also unveiled during Macron's speech in 2018, which was accompanied by a call for Paris, Delhi, and Australia access, which was further considered as absolutely key to frame the region and frame a common interests in the Indo-Pacific, with Australia and India being described here as critical partners to this Indo-Pacific alliance and access. Thank you.
So as we come to the end of the discussion series, we have discussed a bit about exchanges and partnerships in the region, especially when we talk about supply chains, freedom of navigations, enhanced economic and security policy. We have touched every aspect of it to make sure that to understand and make sure that we can develop our discourse around France and its implications for Indo-Pacific region stability and partnerships. So by this, I would like to thank all the panelists who are present here. And also to add a note of it, we are the Center for Strategy and Partnerships have just released an Indo-Pacific report a couple of months back. And I would like to thank all the audience and all the panelists who have attended the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.